if someone handed me $1,000 today and told me I had to invest it before the end of the year, here's exactly how I would do it, and more importantly, why I would do it this way. Most people get stuck overthinking investing way more than they need to. They spend weeks or even months trying to pick the perfect investment and get stuck in decision paralysis, waiting for the perfect time to buy or searching for the perfect strategy that guarantees that they won't lose money. Meanwhile, the people who quietly build wealth over time are usually just the ones who keep things simple and got started early, even though they might not have felt like they've mastered the art of investing yet. Also, I finally started playing Black Ops 2 again, and I realized this is the Call of Duty that I'm best at. And you guys will see it in this video. I finally start catching fire in this gameplay. So hopefully you guys enjoy watching me wreck some people in this gameplay. So in this video, I want to walk you through a very simple framework and show you exactly what I would invest in if I stumbled upon $1,000 laying on the ground. And the reason why I'm using $1,000 for this example is simply just because it's an easy number to break out into percentages. I really could have used $10, $100, 1,000, 10,000. My investing strategy really doesn't change. But before investing a single dollar, the very first thing I would make sure I have set up is the right type of investment account. And again, don't delay investing because you are stuck choosing between accounts. Hopefully this video can go through the basics really quick, but understand that once you get started, it's okay to change course once you learn more. Just don't get in the habit of doing that too often because you're going to get wrecked on taxes. But ultimately, where you invest your money can matter just as much as what you invest in. The type of account you use can change how your money is taxed and how flexible that money is, meaning when you can withdraw that money without paying additional taxes. For example, if you have access to a 401k through your employer and your goal is long-term retirement investing, that is usually one of the best places to start, especially if your employer offers any kind of match. That match is essentially free money being added to your investment, which is always nice. Another extremely popular option for retirement investing is a Roth IRA, which allows your investments to grow completely tax-free over time as long as you follow the rules around withdrawals. And when you start thinking decades into the future, having an account where all of that compounding growth is shielded from taxes can be extremely powerful. Now, on the other hand, if your goal is more flexibility, meaning you might want to access that money earlier for things like buying a house, starting a business, or just building general wealth outside of retirement accounts, then a taxable brokerage account is usually the most straightforward option. A taxable brokerage account doesn't have the same tax advantages as retirement accounts, but it gives you complete flexibility for when you can withdraw your money. You obviously have to sell your investments to withdraw your money, but you get the point here. Now, I'm not going to deep dive into every account. I kind of just glossed over the three big ones. But the important takeaway here is that you should have a general idea of your goal before you start investing. But at the same time, don't get stuck in decision paralysis. You want to ask yourself these questions. Are you investing for retirement? Are you trying to build flexible wealth outside of retirement? Or are you doing a combination of both? Start thinking about this as we get into the heart of this video. So let's say you're walking down the street and you somehow stumble upon $1,000 and someone tells you that you have to invest that right now. No sitting on the sidelines, no leaving it in a cash savings account. You have to put this $1,000 you stumbled upon to work and invest it. So what should you actually do with it? So the very first thing I would do is I'd take $500 of that $1,000 and put it straight into VOO, which is an ETF that tracks the S&P 500. And the reason I would start here is very simple. Instant diversification across 500 of the largest and most successful companies in the United States. Instead of trying to guess which single company is going to outperform over the next decade or trying to pick the next Apple, Nvidia, Tesla, what you're doing with an index fund like this is buying a tiny piece of hundreds of companies all at once. When you buy something like VOO, you're automatically investing in companies like Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Google, hundreds of other major businesses that are collectively representing a huge portion of the American economy. And historically speaking, the S&P 500 has essentially been the benchmark for long-term investing performance. Over long periods of time, it has averaged roughly a 10% annual return, and while that doesn't mean every single year will be positive, Some years will be down, some years will be flat, but over long time horizons, it has proven to be one of the most reliable wealth building tools available to the everyday person. For most people, simply investing in the broad market and staying invested for decades ends up outperforming the majority of investors who constantly jump in and out of investments trying to chase the next big thing. Now, if you're someone who doesn't love the idea of being heavily invested in the United States alone, then you should look at adding international exposure to your portfolio. For example, instead of putting the full 50% into VOO, you can split that allocation and do something like 25% into VOO and 25% into VTIAX, which gives you exposure to international markets outside of the United States. That way, you're still invested in the American economy, but you're also getting exposure to companies in Europe, Asia, and emerging markets around the world. But as most of you already know from watching this channel, I personally lean heavily towards the United States when it comes to investing. I'm a firm believer in the long-term strength of the US economy, the innovation that comes with the American companies, and the overall stability of our markets compared to most other parts around the world. So for me personally, I'm very comfortable having a large portion of my portfolio invested in something like the S&P 500 because I believe that over the course of our lifetimes, the United States will likely continue to be one of the strongest economic engines in the world. So next, I would take about 300 of that $1,000 and allocate it towards a growth-focused ETF, and one that I personally like is SCHG, which is the Charles Schwab US Large Cap Growth ETF. This ETF tracks the Dow Jones US Large Cap Growth Index and focuses on companies that are growing revenue, growing their earnings, and climbing up the ranks at a faster pace than the average company in the market. When you think about growth stocks, you're usually thinking about companies that are reinvesting heavily into their own expansion and their own business instead of paying out profits to shareholders. These are businesses that are constantly developing new products, building new technology, trying to dominate their industries over the long term. And because of that, growth companies tend to have a little more volatility in the short term, but they also tend to drive a lot of the market's upside over long periods of time. When you look inside a growth ETF like SCHG, you'll see many of the companies that are essentially shaping the future of the economy in the tech world. You get companies like Apple, Microsoft, Nvidia, Amazon that are all constantly pushing technology forward and expanding their global footprint. In my own portfolio, I actually split my growth exposure between SCHG and XLK because I'm comfortable taking that bit of a risk. But for this video and for my recommendation here of finding the $1,000 on the ground, I would just stick with SCHG. But that's just my personal preference, and this is where your own risk tolerance comes into play. Some people prefer a little bit more balance, while others are comfortable leaning heavier into sectors like technology that have historically driven a lot of the market's growth. The important thing to understand is that growth ETFs are meant to complement your broader market exposure and add a little extra upside potential for your portfolio over time. Next up is dividend investing, and this is where I would take about $150 of that $1,000, so roughly like 15% of the portfolio, and put it into what I personally consider the GOAT of dividend investing, which is SCHD. SCHD is the Charles Schwab US Dividend Equity ETF, which makes it interesting that it only focuses on specifically high quality companies that have a strong track record of paying and growing dividends to their shareholders. SCHD is filled with like well-established companies that have already proven themselves over time. When you look at the types of companies inside of SCHD, you're usually going to see names that have been around for decades that generate massive amounts of cash flow every single year. Think companies like Chevron, Lockheed Martin, Coca-Cola, Pepsi, Home Depot, businesses that are deeply embedded into the US economy and produce products or goods that people are going to continue to use regardless of what the stock market is doing in the short term. And that's really the appeal of dividend investing. These companies aren't always the fastest growing businesses in the world, but they tend to be incredibly profitable and consistently return a portion of all those profits back to you in the form of a dividend. So when you invest in something like SCHD, you're not just relying on stock price appreciation to build wealth, you're also receiving regular dividend cash payments simply for owning the investment. Another reason I like having dividend exposure in a portfolio like this is because it tends to add a little bit more stability. Growth and tech stocks can be incredible performers during strong markets, but they can also be more volatile when the market starts to pull back. Dividend focused companies, on the other hand, tend to be more mature businesses that generate reliable profits regardless of what's happening in the broader market. And over long periods of time, that combination of broad market exposure, growth investing, and dividend income can create a really well rounded portfolio that gives you growth potential while still maintaining some stability and dividend payouts along the way. And for the final $50, about 5% of the portfolio, I would allocate that towards something a little more risky like Bitcoin. And if crypto isn't really your thing, you could also just use the small slice that you have left for something like gold or silver instead. The point of this last little bit of money that you have to invest is about giving yourself exposure to an asset that has a very different outlook compared to traditional ETFs or stocks. Personally, I believe there is a lot of long term potential in Bitcoin, and we're still in the early stages of seeing how it fits into the global financial system. You now have major institutions holding Bitcoin and more infrastructure being built around it every year. So, from my perspective, having at least some exposure to Bitcoin for me makes sense. Now, at the same time, Bitcoin is obviously much more volatile than traditional investments. It can swing up or down dramatically in a short period of time, which is exactly why I would keep the allocation small. If Bitcoin doubles or triples over the next decade, that 5% allocation could be a nice boost to your portfolio. But if it goes in a major downturn, it's not going to derail your entire investing strategy either. And honestly, this part of the allocation is just psychological for me as well. I've watched Bitcoin go through several massive growth cycles over the last decade, and I really don't want to sit on the sidelines again and watch another wave of growth happen without having at least some skin in the game. And it also adds another layer of diversification to the portfolio because so far, everything we've talked about has been tied directly to the US stock market. And like I talked about earlier, I'm good with that, but I also just want to have a little bit, like adding something like Bitcoin, that gives me exposure to an asset that behaves different than everything else. So that's all I have for this video. Obviously, this is not professional financial advice. I am just your everyday run of the mill engineer who loves talking about personal finance. I'm just speaking from my experience here, and hopefully, videos like this can inspire those to start investing early and taking their finances seriously. Because I did at an early age ish, and it has changed the financial trajectory of my life forever. As always, thanks everyone for staying to the end. Give this video a like if you enjoyed and you want to support the channel. I'll see you all in the next one.